Knight may be the most simple card in Clash Royale. Although there are some fairly complicated common cards today, this was a day 1 card, and those early commons were the epitome of simple. That's not a bad thing though. In fact, this simplicity ironically makes him stand out. Not every card has to be over the top with deep complex mechanics. Most decks need a solid balance. What he lacks in ability, he makes up for in stats, and these stats have granted him a place in some of the most iconic decks in Clash Royale history. Not making a huge splash has allowed him to slide under the radar a lot. If you compare gameplay from now and back in 2016, he seems almost identical, but he's received 12 balance changes across the years, and he would eventually get an evolution form of which got an additional 6 balance changes. His journey has made him become one of the most important and iconic cards in this game, and Clash Royale would never feel right without him. So today, we're going to cover all of the Knight's developments, his rises and falls, all his balance changes, and look at how he's performing today. Knight has been in the game since the very first day, released as one of the OG 42 cards. Not only was he in the original batch of cards, but he is the very first card you play in the game's tutorial. You start Clash Royale with only 6 cards, and Knight was one of them. I wanted to point that out specifically because in the Knight's official trailer, it says, "Unlock the Knight," which is impossible because you start with him. He was very straightforward, very easy to use, very reliable, and very low risk due to his 3 elixir cost. It's understandable why the game wants you to play him first. But what situations exactly would you want to use this card in? If you look at gameplay side by side from January 2016 and January 2025, it looks pretty similar, but there are some significant stat differences. Knight didn't deal that much damage per swing, so it couldn't even one-shot goblins, but on the plus side, he had one of the highest health per elixir ratios of any card. Even at equal level, he would be able to survive a 6 elixir rocket. This made spells practically useless against him, which was a significant plus. Allowing him to absorb so much damage for such a low cost made him an excellent defensive choice against smaller things. He could counter so many troops one-on-one for a positive elixir trade with the tower's assistance. He was even decent against flying units just because he could tank so many hits while the tower took them down. His real weakness was building targeting troops. He may have had a lot of health, but that didn't matter when troops would simply ignore him. Knight was a terrible counter against cards like Giant and Hog Rider, and the majority of decks had at least one building targeting troop, so that was something to keep in mind. All in all, he had a fair amount of strengths and weaknesses. The question was, is this card going to be something new players grow out of soon after the tutorial, or could it see some decent use in high-level play? Well, the best way to know the answer to that is to look at the top ladder usage rates. And if we look at the earliest top ladder stats available, it shows Knight with an 18% usage rate in the top 100. With 42 cards in the game, the average use rate was about 19%, so Knight was in a very healthy position statistically. This was about as average of a performance as you could hope for. But this was not a stable time for the game, so things would quickly change. As the meta developed, Knight's usage quickly began spiraling downward. Hog Rider, Prince, Barbarians were some of the biggest meta drivers early on, and Knight just wasn't very good against any of these. Knight was situational. There were just better, safer options. By February, its top ladder use rate had dropped to as low as 3%, making it the 6th least used card in that area of the game. And things were going to get worse before they got better. In March, the Prince meta was only getting bigger. Following the addition of the new Dark Prince, P.E.K.K.A. Double Prince began to rise in the leading weeks. Knight was actually okay against the Dark Prince since that card dealt a low amount of damage, but the amount of P.E.K.K.A. Prince going around made Knight a suboptimal option. Those cards dealt a ton of damage per hit, so despite Knight having a lot of health, it wasn't going to be effective against them in most scenarios. With the other cards I mentioned still being prominent as well, it's no shock that by May, Knight's top ladder use rate fell to just 1%, indicating it was one of the worst cards. Which is shocking because he could still get a positive elixir trade against a wide variety of cards. Other options simply outshined it though. You could counter a Musketeer with a Knight for a positive elixir trade, or you could counter it with a Prince and get a ton of offensive pressure afterwards. And that Prince was going to be a much better counter to other things like Hog Rider or Barbarians. Knight was fine at the lower levels, but once you got higher, you would want to switch him for a better option. Knight technically received a balance change in February, decreasing his sight range, but that was just a standardization change made to all troops. There were so many sets of balance changes in early 2016, and Knight was one of the few cards to avoid all of them. He seemed fine in the beginning, but with his awful performance in the last few months, Supercell decided to step in and give him his first real balance change, which would come on May 18th. In this set of changes, his health would be increased by 10%, which is very significant considering he already had a lot of health. The timing of this was no surprise because it came shortly after the release of the Miner, who had fairly similar stats to Knight. He actually dealt 1 more damage than Knight at level 9 and also had a lot of hit points for a 3 elixir unit, being able to survive any spell up to and including lightning. Even though Knight would still be slightly better in defensive situations, a defensive miner could handle a lot of what Knight could and potentially still provide better offensive pressure because it moved 1.5 times faster than Knight. And in the same set of balance changes, its health was going to be increased, diminishing the Knight's advantage even further if it was left alone. To prevent Knight from being totally outclassed, he got more hit points than Miner got. There were no significant interaction changes, but there's no doubt this would make a difference. The only question was, how much? After the changes went live, you still weren't seeing very much Knight play. You did see a very small spike in usage following the buff, but that quickly dwindled down. By July, it finally hit 0% usage in top ladder. It was performing just as bad, if not worse, than before the buff. Valkyrie and Mini P.E.K.K.A both filled similar roles, and they were significantly better choices in this environment because Hog Rider was thriving with the rise of Trifecta, and they were better support and counter options. However, there would soon be a surprising turn of events. Just when it seemed like the Knight desperately needed another buff, he started seeing play with 3 Musketeers. Both of these decks were used in top ladder in August, and they were the only decks you saw Knight in for that month. This was interesting because Knight wasn't really played in the way you would have expected. Rather than being used primarily on defense to get trades, he was used as protection to the Musketeers. When playing this card, you'd very often split them to avoid giving spell value, so the Knight could be placed on the side with 1 Musketeer to make it way more threatening. You don't want to ignore 1 Musketeer, but it's not the end of the world if you do. However, with that Knight supporting it, you had to deal with it or else that tower was down. This is where that hit point value really shined. Valkyrie and Mini P.E.K.K.A being 1 more elixir and giving less hit points per elixir was primarily why they weren't chosen for these decks. Valkyrie was dwindling in popularity too, so the following month you saw some players replacing Valkyrie with Knight in Hog Freeze. Knight's overall usage was still low, but it seemed to be finding a place. It wasn't really certain where Knight would settle until one specific card released in October. On October 14th, Ice Golem was released as a 2 elixir mini tank. This card gave you more hit points per elixir than any of the others, and with its lower cost, it was very versatile. It may not have been as good a defensive option as Knight in a lot of scenarios, but it filled the role of being a damage absorber much better, and since that's what Knight was primarily being used for, it took another hit once Ice Golem started to wiggle its way into the meta. Ice Golem was incredibly popular by the end of 2016, being the only viable mini tank. Knight, Valkyrie, and Mini P.E.K.K.A all had 0% usage rates in top ladder. Its primary function was absorbing damage, which is what the Knight was mainly being used for, so there was really no reason to use it now. It was the most popular troop, being used in 2/3 of top ladder decks. Knight wasn't going to have a shot until this monster was toned down. Once that happened and the smoke cleared, Knight would hopefully be able to wiggle its way back into a few niche decks. It wouldn't be until January 23, 2017 for Ice Golem to get the Nerf hammer, and we would see some interesting Knight development shortly after. In the same set of balance changes, Zat would receive a major nerf, sparking the rise of the Logbait archetype, and Knight pretty quickly found a spot in this. He was cheap and easy to cycle, and since Logbait decks were about cycling quickly, he was a natural fit. He worked especially good with Goblin Barrel now thanks to the Zap nerf, because if the opponent zapped the goblins from the barrel while Knight tanked for them now, they would survive with a sliver of health and continue to attack, taking down the whole tower if not further attended to. Lightning also had a surge in popularity, so his spell resistance was coming in handy. 3 Musketeers started to rise with Knight again, and he was a good pairing in this meta because in a pinch he could tank one of the lightning strikes. Even Royal Giant decks were starting to include it. It was a very good time for the card. It went from 0 people in top 100 ladder playing it to 22 within 1 month. He was now the most used mini tank. His strength and versatility was finally able to shine, and it wasn't stopping here. Over the next few months, Graveyard and Expo decks were including him a lot, along with a new popular Hog Rider deck, on top of all the stuff he was already being seen in. By June, his top ladder usage rate had peaked at 40%, making him the 3rd most used troop. Even as the meta was changing into becoming more beatdown and bridge spam oriented, Knight was adapting nicely. Logbait consistently remained as one of the, if not the most popular archetype throughout 2017, which carried Knight very far. The comeback from having no relevance to being a top 5 card with no balance changes is an impressive feat, but it was getting frustrating to some people. I think a big reason was thanks to this popular Mortar Cycle deck. This was easily one of the, if not the most defensive deck in the game. Many matches that had this deck in it ended in a draw or getting rocket cycled to death. It promoted the type of gameplay Supercell had always been adamant on not promoting, and since Knight played a huge part in it, it was taking some of the flack. Knight was certainly not the most annoying card to go against, but it consistently had around a 30 to 40% usage rate from March to November, meaning you were probably seeing it every 2 to 3 matches for months. This was about triple the usage you'd want a card to be at. It's one thing for a card to have a surge for a month or two, but Knight clearly wasn't going anywhere. Plus, it was completely outshining Valkyrie, taking spots in all the types of decks she was previously seen in. It had gone on for too long, so it was time for a nerf. On December 12, 2017, Knight's hit speed would be increased by 1/10 of a second. In addition, its first hit attack time would be increased by 1/10 of a second. The biggest complaint seems to be his high amount of hit points, so this was an interesting approach. I think part of the reason was to help Valkyrie indirectly. Valkyrie was already much better at taking out swarms obviously, but there were a lot of situations where Knight would be good enough, so you wouldn't need Valkyrie and you could utilize Knight's other benefits without much retribution. His damage per second was decreased by about 9%, but he already wasn't a high damage dealer. If this was everything, Knight probably would have been fine, but there were some other changes that would affect its place. As I said, Logbait was the main thing Knight was appearing in at this point, and several other cards in the main variant were getting nerfed as well. But perhaps the biggest contributor to Knight's struggle in December was due to a new card, the Royal Ghost. Another 3 elixir melee card with a high number of hit points for its cost. This card would be really strong upon its release, and since it was in a similar category to Knight, it was going to take away some spotlight. It did hit slower, but it dealt significantly more damage per swing and area damage, so it would be decent against swarms. It could even one-shot loggable cards like Princess and Dark Goblin. On top of all that, it moved 1.5 times faster than Knight and turned invisible, becoming untargetable when not attacking, making it significantly better at offensive pressuring. That last part did come with a caveat though, being that it couldn't tank as well as Knight, but that didn't really matter now because Royal Ghost was insanely good. Due to all these factors, Knight's usage fell to about 12% in top ladder, which is actually still about average for the time. Even though Royal Ghost was used in a lot of different things Knight previously was used in, Hog X NATO and Logbait decks opted to keep the Knight because being able to tank for the more valuable units was critical in those decks. So although it had fallen from its peak, it was far from dead. Royal Ghost would be nerfed the following January, and Knight would see another rise shortly after. It was still slightly overperforming, and I guess Supercell didn't like that because it got another nerf in February. His ability to tank as much as he could was too much, so this time its hit points were being decreased by 6%. This was a significant decrease. Most troops would be able to take Knight out one hit faster than before, and this included P.E.K.K.A. Now Knight would die in just 2 P.E.K.K.A. swings. Compared to his vanilla form, he was arguably in a worse position now. He had barely more hit points and a slower hit speed. But obviously it was a completely different environment, so who knew? Very quickly, it became apparent how devastating this nerf was. Being so much more fragile now, it wasn't reliable or enticing enough to include in most decks. Valkyrie started replacing it in Logbait, and Ice Golem was used as the mini tank of choice in most other decks that had one. By the end of March, it was used in just 3% of top ladder decks, the lowest it had been in over a year, and it didn't appear in any of the top meta decks. It really made me wonder why they were so quick to nerf this card a second time. They had taken a moderate approach the first go around, and after that December nerf, the rates were consistently lower than they were for most of 2017, so I thought they let it settle for a little while longer before taking further action. It just seemed a little reckless to me. And it looks like Supercell realized that too, because Knight would receive yet another balance change in April. This would be another hit point change, this time increasing it by 3%. A very small amount that once again wouldn't have any significant interaction changes. In their explanation, they explained that Knight was still versatile and popular, and this buff was to help boost his usage in competitive play. Comparing the top ladder usage rates to the rates across the entire game, you can see a clear distinction. Knight was simple to use and easy to level up, so it's understandable why you see him a lot more in casual play. Following this 3% health increase, you saw a noticeable uptick in Knight's general usage, but he still wasn't a popular choice in competitive areas. In fact, his top ladder usage fell from the end of March to the end of April. Knight definitely had potential, but it wasn't the right environment for him right now, and that potential right environment wasn't going to come anytime soon. One reason being that the following June, Valkyrie would receive major buffs, generally making her the best mini tank of choice. Especially when you have cards like Three Musketeers, Goblin Gang, Witch, and the soon-to-be released Royal Recruits dominating the meta, that splash was nice to have. The Rascals had also been recently released, and they were being used in some popular versions of Logbait and Mortar that ditched the Knight, since the Rascal Boy pretty much filled that role. It was looking really bad for Knight, but rather than simply just nerfing the meta drivers, they decided to buff the Knight yet again in August 2018. In this set of balance changes, Knight's damage would be increased by 5%. With this little extra damage, he could take out a Goblin in one hit now. This was a huge deal that would make him much more effective against Logbait. It was a very generous buff, but arguably necessary considering how well Valkyrie and Royal Ghost were doing. It was a better approach than trying to increase and decrease his health by smidges. Even after this little boost though, Valkyrie and Royal Ghost were drastically outshining it. The next month, Valkyrie would receive a nerf, and 2 months after that, Royal Ghost was nerfed. Competition seemed to be the biggest thing keeping Knight down, so these nerfs combined with the Knight buff made Knight seem way more appealing. But even after all this, it was still underperforming. 2018 in general had just been a terrible year for the Knight. Ever since that devastating health nerf in February, it was never able to recover. By January 2019, it had a very low use rate with one of the lowest win rates in the game. It was clearly still very weak, and at this point it hadn't seen any real competitive use in close to a year, so in February 2019, Knight would receive another buff. This time, it would be another health increase, but only by 2.5%. It still wouldn't have quite as many hit points as it did at its peak, but this meant Knight took 3 hits from a P.E.K.K.A to die instead of 2 again. Even though Knight hadn't really been good competitively, it was still a popular casual card, which made some players question why they were buffing it so much. Now, people do like to advocate for buffs and nerfs based on their own personal experience rather than data, but even that aside, it was a legitimate question. If this card is so heavily used in the lower arenas, why have they been putting so much focus on trying to get this card to be used competitively? Did every single card need to be equal on a competitive level regardless of how it disrupts other areas of the game? Supercell has never treated every card equally. They've balanced certain cards based on low ladder stats before. If any card deserves to be treated like that, Knight seems like the obvious pick. It's one of the simplest cards to use, a card that teaches you how to play Clash Royale. Is this the type of card that should be all over the competitive scene? A basic starter card? What does Knight bring to the competitive scene that couldn't be substituted by a more interesting alternative? It's crazy how much they were buffing Knight to try to bring it back after being so quick to nerf it multiple times back to back just a year prior. It's like Supercell couldn't make up their mind. But anyway, with this extra help, could the Knight finally make a comeback? To put it simply, no. This buff hardly made a difference. Knight was really only seen in Classic log bait at this point, and even that deck was underperforming. Comparing the Grand Challenge rates from before and after, you can see the buff may as well have never happened. The bridge spam archetype was very popular through 2019, and Knight just wasn't the best counter or use to those decks. Since P.E.K.K.A was very often seen in these decks, that can explain why they buffed the health specifically to make it better against P.E.K.K.A and not much else. I like what they were thinking, but it just wasn't enough. The role Knight filled was also just getting more overcrowded. Lumberjack had been rising in popularity, and it was great against a lot of bridge spam cards. Even if this card was reverted to its exact pre-December 2017 state, I'm not sure it would have been nearly as strong as it was then. Luckily though, its next buff wouldn't be too far away. Just 5 months later, Knight would appear in the balance changes yet again. It was just a standardization adjustment, but it was significant nonetheless. Melee ranges were simplified to go into one of 3 categories, and Knight's current range of 1 tile didn't fit into any of them, so it was increased to 1.2 tiles to fit into the new melee medium category. A range increase is a pretty big deal, even a small one, especially for a slower card, so it's definitely worth acknowledging. And unlike the previous health buff, you did see a slow trickle up in use and win rates in the preceding months. Although, this could have easily been partially due to other environmental factors. You see, in August, the P.E.K.K.A received a rework that caused it to surge in popularity, and Expo decks were good against P.E.K.K.A decks, so you saw a lot more Expo. Ice Golem had been the primary choice as a mini-tank in these decks for a long time, but with P.E.K.K.A being as prominent as it was, a 3 elixir troop that took 3 P.E.K.K.A hits to take out was definitely appealing in this environment. There were 2 main Expo decks going around, 2.9 Cycle and Ice Bow, and although Ice Golem was still a popular choice, you did see some players switching to Knight. And despite P.E.K.K.A being toned down just 1 month later, Knight continued to see play in Expo. But the 2019 meta is infamously crazy, so things were changing soon once again. In October, you saw the release of the new Elixir Golem and a huge rise in Witch and Wallbreaker usage, which heavily drove up demand for Valkyrie, leaving Knight as the weaker choice. Elixir Golem continued to thrive, leaving Knight in a very weak spot. Its rates indicated it was back to being borderline unviable. It had been another pretty underwhelming year for Knight, so once again, for the 5th time in a row, Supercell was giving it a buff. In December 2019, they would increase his health by 5%. This meant now he would have more hit points than at any other previous point, which really goes to show how much the environment changed, or how reckless this buff was. Time would only tell. Supercell had been slowly buffing this card bit by bit for nearly 2 years now. Knight hadn't been totally dead, but it wasn't really meta at any point since just after 2017, and now it was almost 2020. Looking at its initial performance, you can see this buff really made a difference. Besides log bait, he was becoming a very popular choice in graveyard decks. 2020 was looking to be an excellent year for the Knight. It was certainly going to be a very eventful year. This was just the start. Throughout 2020, we would see Knight's rate slowly trickle up thanks to numerous environmental factors, one of which was sparked by the hut reworks in February and April. After the Barbarian hut rework in February 2020, Graveyard saw a spike in popularity in March as the decks benefited greatly from it. Goblin Hut was also very popular with Graveyard after the rework. This variant in particular was the most popular deck of the season, making up 2% of all decks played in the game at one point. You also saw a Skeleton Barrel rework in April, leading to this variant of Logbait gaining quite a bit of popularity, even surpassing classic Logbait. This minor control deck that utilized both the Goblin Hut and Skeleton Barrel also contributed to Knight's overall usage. Thanks to these two cards, Knight managed to work his way into about 1/4 of Grand Challenge decks. Following the inevitable Goblin Hut nerf in May, there was a noticeable dip, but the developments were not over. New variants of minor control kept the Knight, and Hog Earthquake decks were opting to include it. This was pretty huge because in the past, Ice Golem or Valkyrie had almost always been the mini tank of choice in these decks. Even though Valkyrie and Knight had been pretty even in terms of usage coming into the year, by now you can see they've separated drastically despite neither receiving a balance change. Knight had solidified itself as being an important part of many archetypes by now and a flexible substitute to other mini tanks if need be. By the end of July, he was being used in 30% of Grand Challenge decks, which meant Knight was the #1 most used troop card in competitive play. For some reason, this was just such a hard card for the devs to get right. They had tweaked his health by such small amounts numerous times to find that perfect middle ground, but he was either performing way above average or way below average. This means they probably should have tweaked a different stat going forward. However, despite being the most used troop in the game, Knight was not going to receive another balance change yet. It may have been in a very unbalanced position statistically, but it wasn't a very disruptive or hated card. Plus, they probably didn't want to react too quickly like they did in the past. In fact, Knight would go the entirety of 2020 without a single balance change, despite there being a new set every month. For the remainder of the year, his usage would hover around 25%, keeping him as one of the most popular troops. In November, he had even hit 34% usage, meaning he was appearing in more than 1 in 3 decks. Logbait, Graveyard, Mortar, Hog Rider, Minor Control, and Expo decks were all still including it. But even this didn't prompt Supercell to nerf it in the December balance changes. They gave Expo, Graveyard, and Skeleton Barrel nerfs in the December balance changes, which would hurt the Knight's most popular decks, but it was still doing just fine. With how well this card was able to adapt to the meta, I don't think any indirect nerf could knock it out of the meta. Even though it may have dropped a little bit due to some indirect nerfs in December, we could already see it trickling back up in 2021. By February, we could already see the use rate back up to nearly 30%, once again claiming the most popular troop spot. Some players had been questioning why a card with such high rates had been avoiding the nerf hammer for so long, and I understand where they're coming from. How is it fair for Supercell to nerf some cards with decent rates, but not the Knight who has way better rates? Again, Knight may not have been the most hated card, but seeing any one card so much was repetitive and exhausting. And the fact it was so popular was making it harder for some of the other mini-tanks to find their place. They had Knight run rampant long enough, so finally in March 2021, Supercell decided it was finally time for a nerf. There's a lot of different directions they could go when changing the Knight. They haven't changed much besides his health, but they decided to go with a health decrease again. I think this was a terrible way to go. This way of balancing clearly wasn't working for Knight. I don't know why they were so adamant on adjusting this one stat. This change would also just be a straight reversion of the 5% buff from December 2019. And once again, I know you could argue that the environment was much different now than in 2019, but it still didn't feel like the right approach to me. Their explanation of this change confused me even further. They explained that Knight and Elite Barbarians were on opposite sides of the same spectrum and that nerfing Knight's hit points would hopefully encourage some people to use the E-Barbs over it. Out of all the cards I would have expected them to compare Knight to, Elite Barbarians wouldn't have made my top 10. Valkyrie, Ice Golem, and Royal Ghost I would have expected, maybe Dark Prince, Lumberjack, or Mini P.E.K.K.A, but Elite Barbarians were double the price. They were in a totally different category. Their only real similarity is that they're melee cards. They're played very differently than Knight. You could easily swap out a Knight for a Valkyrie or Ice Golem and vice versa, but nobody was going to replace their Knight with Elite Barbarians, especially in their Logbait or Expo deck, no matter how good they may have been by comparison. It doesn't really matter though. Knight needed a nerf. I just think the reasoning here was a bit odd. But would Knight still be viable after this? last time it was in this state, it needed a buff. On the other hand, it's hard to imagine the meta without Knight at this point. With how many different popular decks it was present in, it seemed impossible for it to just fall out of the meta because of a small health decrease. Looking at its performance a few weeks after the nerf, it was still doing just fine. Logbait, Expo, and Hog Rider were still often including it. Even though Elite Barbarians were very strong during this period, they weren't replacing Knight in its most popular decks. It was fine for now, so maybe the team made the right decision, but it was still early on, so only time would tell. Things would remain steady for a few months, but in June, we would see a major dip in Knight usage and winnage. This is the same month we got introduced to the Goblin Drill, a very influential card upon release. The Knight was not a great counter to this card, and that alone was enough to knock it out of the meta. Valkyrie, on the other hand, was one of the, if not the best counter to it, so that was being subbed in for Knight a lot. But this was only temporary while Goblin Drill was in the meta. Once that was properly nerfed in September, Knight had a resurgence. And once again, it was performing about average. It didn't really seem like there was going to be any more permanent developments for Knight, at least not anytime soon. But little did we know yet that the game's environment would keep evolving to ensure Valkyrie as the best mini-tank. In October, we would see the release of Champions, one of which was the Skeleton King. Now, this one wasn't great at first, but he'd quickly find his way into the meta. This was kind of a walking graveyard, so Knight would get shredded against the fully charged Skeleton King. Valkyrie, on the other hand, was the perfect counter. Skeleton King also brought up a lot of other Swarm cards, so having reliable splash was critical in this environment. Knight was still okay ending off the year, but he had definitely had better days, and the future was looking shaky. 2022 was a rough year for Knight. He was on a downward spiral. His rates dwindled further and further as having splash stayed necessary. Royal Ghost and Valkyrie were outshining him immensely, and this wasn't going to change without some major overhauls to the meta or a direct buff to Knight. The only time it was really used was if there was already plenty of other splash sources in the deck, or if the deck needed the cheaper option to better utilize the champion's 3-card cycle. By June, his usage was the lowest it had been in years, with his win rate in the 30s, once again showing that the health change may have been the wrong thing to change about the card. No matter how many times they changed it, it was not settling in a healthy position. So, in October of that year, Knight would appear in the balance changes yet again, and would you believe it, it was getting a health change. This time, it was increased by 3%. One interesting thing about this change is that it actually got delayed because, according to a community manager, there was an issue with interactions that would require a client update. This was quite interesting because Knight had never needed a client update for a simple health change before. They don't go into detail into exactly what the problem was, but there was likely going to be inconsistencies of interactions at different levels, so they had to manually change the numbers. This change ended up coming at the end of the month as a result. But even after this, Knight wasn't in a great spot, so a few months later, in February 2023, Knight would appear in the balance changes yet again. And it was the exact same change, a health increase of 3%. I thought this one was a little hasty, even though Knight was slightly underperforming, because the environment just didn't seem particularly good at the time. I think it would have been better to see how it developed over a few more months. Fun fact, following this change, Knight had more health than he's ever had before. This was crazy to think about considering when he had 1399 hit points for most of 2016 and 2017, he was thought of as being unfathomably tanky for just 3 elixir. I think those hit speed nerfs he got in December 2017 did a lot more damage than people realize. He may have been as tanky as ever, but each hit point is less valuable when he attacks slower. Initially, Knight had a huge spike in usage, but this spike had very little if anything to do with the Knight buff. This was more to do with the Archers buff. Archers were really strong after the February balance changes, and them and Knight had worked well together in Siege decks in the past. So in February, you saw a lot of Siege utilizing the Knight Archers combo, but even before the inevitable Archers nerf, these decks were falling. By March, Mighty Miner had replaced Knight in the popular Siege decks it had been seen in, causing Knight's rates to fall to about what they were before the February buff. The April balance changes toned down the Archers, which wasn't good for Knight, but it ultimately didn't have too drastic of an effect. We would see further development after the June balance changes, which nerfed Mighty Miner and buffed the Ice Wizard. Mighty Miner had been taking a lot of the Knight's spots, but with him being worse, Knight started to make a comeback. The Ice Wizard buff encouraged more people to use Splash Yard again, a deck that had been dwindling previously partially thanks to the Ice Wizard's poor performance. Thanks to these developments, Knight actually had a fairly decent performance in June, being about as average as you could hope for. And it seemed to be settling here as it continued to perform about as well in July. After so much time and effort and 8 health adjustments, it seemed like Supercell finally got the balance perfect. But nothing ever ends on a sweet note in Clash Royale because this is Clash Royale. So of course, Supercell had to go ahead and pull a Supercell. You see, in August 2023, Knight was going to break Clash Royale like never before. This was all thanks to evolutions. As you know, evolutions are essentially just upgrades and new abilities to already existing cards, and the general power level of an evolution back in 2023 was much higher than the ones we get nowadays. But even with that in mind, Knight would still end up being on a whole different power level. Right off the bat, his new ability of course had to do with his health. When moving, an evolved Knight would take 80% less damage. That's insane by itself, but on top of that, his base hit points would be 30% higher than the original Knight. So effectively, when moving, he had 11,480 hit points at level 11. That's more than 2 golems. This made spells, ranged, and air units significantly worse against him. If that wasn't bad enough, the evolved Knight's hit speed would be 0.3 of a second faster and deal 10% more damage per swing. If you thought the Knight was annoyingly tanky before, you were going to hate the game a lot in the next few months. Just to give you an idea of how insane this is, if perfectly placed, an evolved Knight could fully counter a 6 elixir Sparky by tanking 2 full blasts, then proceed to take down an entire Princess Tower by itself. The community was up in flames about this. How could Supercell release something so blatantly overpowered? Now, there have been times where the community overreacted thinking something would be way too strong and then it was fine, but just seeing some of the preview clips made it obvious that this was going to be really, really strong. This would officially drop on August 7th, and it was instantly a big hit, easily becoming the most used evolution in Clash Royale. This was perhaps the most broken evolution ever released. I'm talking before and since then. I think it's only rivaled by the evolved Firecracker. Evolutions were not available in Grand Challenges yet, but looking at the Ultimate Champion rates, Evolved Knight was easily the most used card. And even in Grand Challenges, the regular Knight was the most used troop. This card went from being a tad underpowered, but still pretty balanced, to one of the most influential game-breaking cards in Clash Royale history overnight. You saw Evolved Knight in a lot of different decks. At first, it was mostly the same decks Knight was appearing in already, just with the evolved version, but you did see a few new ones pop up within the first week. This Ram Rider deck gained quite a bit of popularity, and I think the most notable one is this Elixir Golem beatdown deck. This one was huge because Knight had never really been a part of a meta beatdown deck. It just never provided a useful role in that archetype, so the fact it was included in one here really goes to show how strong and versatile he was. Nerfs were imminent. After giving players enough time to buy the Diamond Pass, they came down with the Nerf Hammer just 16 days after its release. Its damage reduction boost would be decreased from 80 to 60%. This was a good change. The Evolved Knight felt unkillable because most cards attacked either from the air or at a distance. To effectively counter it, you needed a strong melee card which limited the options. Now something like Inferno Dragon, although still not the most effective option, could be a significantly better choice. This wasn't going to be enough, but it was a good start. This wasn't even at a scheduled set of balance changes, meaning this was probably implemented on short notice, and you don't want to go overboard on shortly planned changes. They've made that mistake in the past. As we move into September, Evolved Knight would finally make his way into Grand Challenges, and to nobody's surprise, he was still the most used card. He was completely dominating the evolution field and was used in almost every archetype. Nearly half of all decks included him, and since only one evolution could be played per deck, that meant he was being used about as much as all the other evolutions combined. Even though it was certainly weaker following the nerf, it didn't feel like it. It was still present in everything it was present in before, and seeing play in more heavy beatdown decks. The meta was revolving around this card, so it's no surprise that it received another nerf in October. In this set of changes, his health would be decreased by 8%. This meant it would still have 20% more than the regular Knight. It seemed like a pretty small nerf considering how powerful he was, but at least they did something. However, the performance afterwards would go on to prove that they should have gone harder because it hardly made a dent. It was still by far the best performing evolution, literally triple the second most used. It was so crazy because this 3 elixir support card was being used as a tank for tanks. Golem, Goblin, and Electro Giant were using it, and the Knight would usually be placed in front of the pushes to block any damage. Very untraditional, but it was smart because when moving, Knight had more hit points than these tanks that were more valuable. I don't know how Evolved Knight was intended to be played, but I'm fairly positive that was not it. With rates like this, another nerf was imminent, and this would come just the following month in November. This time, they were going a bit harder. Instead of messing with the hit points for the 100th time, they would increase his hit speed by 0.2 of a second. meaning it was only 1/10 of a second faster than the normal Knight instead of 3 now. The hit speed reduction was completely unnecessary in the first place, so I'm glad they at least toned it down a bit. But the question was, would this be enough to finally knock Evolved Knight from its throne? To put it simply, no, not at all. Evolved Knight was still easily the most used evolution by 3-fold. The amount of damage it could absorb for just 3 elixir gave value that could not be matched. The Knight in itself was an average card, so adding all these bonuses on top of that was keeping it a very appealing choice. Pair that with the new overpowered Little Prince, and you have some crazy decks keeping Knight as relevant as ever. Now, Knight would actually fall a bit before the next set of changes because also in November, the Evolved Archers were released, and they actually served pretty well compared to Knight, but Knight was undoubtedly still very close to being, if not the best evolution, which makes it all the more surprising that it was exempt from the January 2024 balance changes. That's right, despite being the most used evolution by double digits going into the new year, Knight would not appear in the first set of balance changes. There's only 2 possible reasons I can think of as to why they didn't touch it. One is that they were just tired of nerfing it in every single set of balance changes. The other possible reason I think they may have exempted it was because the Valkyrie evolution was being released this month. This card had been in the shadows ever since Evolved Knight's edition. There hadn't been another Evolved mini-tank up until now, so I think maybe they thought this would cause a good number of players to use this evolution instead of the Knight. This didn't happen though, because the Valkyrie evolution had a very soft launch and was almost never worth using over the Knight. It was weird because they didn't give it any stat bonuses like they did with Knight, so I don't really know how they thought this was going to compete if they did. They nerfed the other top evolutions, so as a result, Evolved Knight was able to remain by far the most popular one. There would be another major development in February as well, that being Clash Royale adding a second evolution slot, meaning the competition for Evolved Knight diminished greatly. There wasn't a huge surge in popularity from this since the Knight was usually already the evolution of choice if you were going to use Knight in a deck, but it is notable. These decks that were already powerful were becoming even more powerful with the assistance of other evolutions. Evo Knight was also being wiggled into some other decks that utilized another evolution before, the greatest example being Hog Earthquake, which had typically used Mighty Miner with the Evolved Firecracker. Finally, in March, Evolved Knight would receive its 4th consecutive nerf. The developers were stepping away from giving evolutions stat bonuses, as we saw from the recent evolutions that were released, so stripping Knight of his extra stats seems like the obvious way to go. In this set of changes, his hit speed was increased by 1/10 of a second, and his damage was decreased by 9%, so now both of these stats would match the regular Knight. Again, I never really understood why they gave him those advantages in the first place. Following these changes, Evolved Knight would finally be knocked from his throne. He had been the most used evolution pretty much since his edition all the way back in August 2023. It had been 7 months of him just completely ruling the game, but now other evolutions were starting to take that seat. Knight was still the 3rd most popular, so he certainly wasn't gone, but the amount of power and influence he had was diminished more than from any other previous nerf. You also have to remember every single month, 1 to 2 more evolutions are added, which is going to crowd the field even further. The only 2 evolutions beating Knight were the Evolved Zap and Bomber, both released right around the time of this Knight nerf, so it was still performing better against all the evolutions it had been competing against for the majority of its life. It really puts into perspective how insane he was back in August 2023. The fact he got so many nerfs and was still one of the top performing cards. No matter how the meta shifted, Knight found a way to thrive. In April, you still saw him in beatdown a lot, and Goblin Drill was quite popular this season as well. Despite Valkyrie taking the spotlight when Drill was super prominent in the past, Knight was the dominant mini-tank this time around. I don't really think any environmental factor was going to change that. Even P.E.K.K.A decks were finding a way to include it. The last nerfs clearly still weren't enough, so Evolved Knight would be nerfed again in May. This time his health was decreased by 8%, meaning he would only have 10% more than the base Knight. In their explanation, they say they're aligning melee evolutions to have similar bonus health. Most of the evolution stat bonuses were toned down in this set of changes. No longer would an evolution's health be more than 10% of its base counterpart. So mainly this change was meant for consistency. But nobody was arguing against Knight needing a nerf. Interestingly enough, after the changes went live, Evolved Knight's popularity started increasing again. How is that even possible? Well, as I said, the May 2024 balance changes had nerfed several evolutions, and a lot of these changes were actually huge. They were really trying to bring the power gap between evolutions and their base counterparts much closer. So by comparison, Knight actually got off pretty easy. On top of just generally having good stats, Siege was incredibly popular this season thanks to the Dagger Duchess and Evolved Tesla, so of course Knight was going to benefit from that. But here's the crazier part. The base regular Knight also had a massive upsurge in popularity in May. combining the use rates tells us that Knight was the most used card, being present in nearly 50% of decks, and it went over 50% in early June. So why would you use the regular Knight when the evolved Knight was right there? Well, as I said, Knight was mostly used in Siege this month, and these decks always contained Skeletons and Tesla, both of which have evolutions of their own. And even though they may have not provided as much value as Knight, their evolutions were arguably much stronger compared to their base counterparts. Base Knight still provided decent value, so he could work fine if he had other strong evolutions to support him. It mostly just depended on your style. Supercell had clearly once again not gone far enough in toning him down, and soon they would decide that enough is enough. On June 17, 2024, the Knight's evolution would receive the final balance change it's ever received, and I think it was almost the best way to wrap up the Knight's balancing journey. If you don't remember, the Knight's first real balance change was back in May 2016, which was a hit point increase of 10%. And now, over 8 years later, as the final balance change to date, the evolved Knight's health would be decreased by 9%. Almost the exact opposite adjustment. This meant the evolved Knight lost its last stat bonus. It had been nearly a year since Evolved Knight's release, and since then they've been stripping every one of his bonus stats one by one. His extra health, damage, and hit speed were all gone. The only thing he had left was his damage reduction ability, which had proven to be so strong on its own. If they were to nerf the Evolved Knight without touching the base counterpart again, they'd have to go after that ability directly. It didn't seem like another health nerf would mean anything at this point. I know it seemed like the tiniest health change made so much of a difference for most of Knight's life, but with the Evolved Knight, the damage reduction minimized the importance of the number of hit points. So where would the Knight land? Well, he was still very popular following this change. He was working great with the new cards that came alongside the balance changes, and those cards were dominating. But we would finally start to see a trickle down come July. Finally, Knight wasn't being used everywhere. You weren't really seeing it in Beatdown or with P.E.K.K.A. anymore, and Evolved Valkyrie was taking the spot in some places Knight previously was. Evolved Knight was really only being seen in Bait, Siege, and this Electro Giant deck was still performing pretty well in July. Thanks to the power gap between the two versions being even closer now though, regular Knight continued to climb in usage. As Evolved Knight trickled down, Base Knight trickled up, and in September their Grand Challenge usage rates matched up, and Base Knight even slightly surpassed Evolved Knight at one point. However, things would take another sharp downward turn in October. Goblinstein, Ram Rider, and Evolved P.E.K.K.A. were thriving, and Knight just didn't have the power to be flexible in an environment like this. Especially with the Evolved's Tesla nerf, Siege was struggling again. Knight's prime was clearly over. Goblinstein started appearing frequently in Logbait and Minor Mortar decks instead of Knight, and other shinier evolutions took the spotlight. And that pretty much brings us to today. Evolved Knight has a pretty average performance and does decently in a few meta decks, but it can't be shoved into anything, and that's how it should be. I think it's in a pretty good position currently, but I know if that changes, they'll fix it. Knight has been balanced every single year of Clash Royale history except 2020 and 2025, which has only begun. Despite being such a simple card, he's had an incredible amount of development, and the game would never feel the same without him. Knight has certainly been one of the least hated cards by the community over the years. It's had its moments for sure, but this is not a card most people want to see dead in the ground. It doesn't have some broken ability or annoying gimmick. He's very predictable and fair. His value comes from his pure stats. This is so iconic that Knight has become synonymous with good stats. That's really his whole image. I bring this up because in 2021, you started to see Knight trending, not in terms of usage, but as a community meme. Anytime Knight was ever brought up, the phrase, "good stats for the cost," was echoed. It was such a common phrase associated with Knight that Supercell even put it as his banner description. And the Knight's face in this banner looks like he's heard the phrase a million times and is tired of it. And that's actually one more thing I wanted to touch up on. You probably saw that the Knight's card icon went from this to this in 2023 when Evolutions were released, and it's arguably one of the biggest downgrades we've seen. The original was so iconic, and the new one looks like he doesn't even know where he is. The community seemed to overwhelmingly agree with this notion, and it makes me wonder why they changed it in the first place. I scroll through a lot of threads while researching for these videos, and I had never seen even a single person complain that the old icon was outdated or ugly before they changed it. It may seem like a petty thing to complain about, but it was genuinely one of my favorite card icons, and I think it was one of the most iconic, so I had to vent. Anyway though, let me know what you think about the Knight and if you think it needs any further changes. Also let me know which card's history you want me to cover next. Thank you all for listening, and I'll catch you later.